Welcome to the Climate Psychiatry Alliance Podcast. I'm Dr. Casey Patnode, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Mario Nahara. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Jeremy Wortzel to the podcast. Jeremy Wortzel is a PGY4 psychiatry resident at Mass General Brigham and Women's Hospital, and he is pursuing child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at Brown University next year. He aims to be a community-focused child and adolescent psychiatrist with a focus on community psychiatry and the environmental determinants of mental health. Jeremy is a resident member of the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Climate Committee, and an American Psychiatric Association Foundation Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellow. His research focuses on the intersection of how green spaces and climate change impact how young people think, feel, and behave. Jeremy holds a Bachelor of Science from Brown University, a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge, in Clinical Research and Experimental Medicine, and an MD, MPH from the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Jeremy. It's really exciting to see you.
Thank you both so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat today.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. On a personal note, I know Jeremy from my transition from emergency medicine back in Boston, and he was one of the folks who was so gracious with his time and helping me explore psychiatry as a field. So I'm personally very grateful for him and happy to see him.
So we usually like to start our episodes with a light question. So tell us, Jeremy, how's the weather where you are right now?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because I feel like it's been fluctuating dramatically. There was like 2 feet of snow in Boston, and then I went away to Moab for a week where it was like 70s and like you're in the desert and it was great. And I got back and everything had melted. And now we're having a little snow flurry this morning. So I don't know, I'm all over the place. It's good. I love the changing seasons. It's one of my favorite things about being on the East Coast. I love the winter, but I always get really excited for the spring and then for the fall and then for the winter again. So I love the changing seasons. Keeps it exciting.
Yeah, I feel that. Lately, I keep thinking it's warm enough to go outside in a t-shirt, and then 5 minutes later, I'm freezing. It's like you can't really trust the weather.
A little bit of a different take on the northeastern weather.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm super excited to discuss Coco's Fire, a children's book with a goal of helping channel climate anxiety into climate action today. While I have a lot I'd really love to say about it, who better to introduce us to the book than Dr. Wortzel as one of the co-authors? Could you share with us a little bit about Coco's Fire?
Yeah. Coco's Fire is really a model of how to have a climate talk in a developmentally informed way with young people. It was developed by a team of psychiatrists and psychologists and educators and environmental scientists with the goal of navigating the narrative of how we introduce climate change to young people in a way that is welcoming. I think for so many of us, climate change is so daunting when it's introduced to us in such a young way. It's really hard for it not to be scary. And yet it's something that everybody learns about and faces. And so having it in a way and introducing it in a way that feels approachable, we thought was just such a key element of how we talk about climate change and things that can lead to anxieties and distresses around climate in the future. And so how we have this conversation was really what rooted the development of this book. And I'm happy to get into all of the nuances and nitty-gritty of how we try to incorporate developmentally appropriate mechanisms of how to approach that conversation. But that was the goal of the book. So it's a narrative. It follows a little squirrel as they learn about climate change or what that is, and the family dynamic of how the parent figure introduces climate change, and not only climate change, but the solutions around climate change to this little one as they're growing and evolving into the climate activists that they are. Obviously, being from a psychological perspective, we try to take a really thoughtful approach, I think thoughtful approach at least, to how we manifest and represent feelings in this book. And so throughout the book, we also follow a little character of really a fire friend. Starts out kind of scary and red, and you see that as Coco is learning and engaging with various communities, activists, politicians, community workers, um, that fire kind of changes from being one of fear to one of excitement and one of inspiration. And I think that also kind of speaks to how, as psychiatrists, it's so pivotal for us to use this platform, because emotions are at the core of most of the work that we do as climate activists as well. And so how we think about this work, I think, really shapes how young people, how the next generation thinks about their engagement with this climate future.
Very well said. And I think that you're, with the goal of being thoughtfully implementing this, I think if I personally had to reflect, I'd say you succeeded in that. There's a lot there. And I think of, a lot of the data showing us that most people are worried about climate change and want to talk about it with the people around them. And then most people also worry that people don't want to talk about climate change. So it's something that we all want to talk about, and it's just difficult to find ways to engage in that. So as we often say in medicine, children are not just little adults, but in terms of the just core message of wanting to communicate this issue to the people in our lives and who we care about. But how do we do that? I think that this is a really interesting way of bringing all those worlds together in terms of a developmentally appropriate mechanism for us to communicate with the people in our lives who we really want to.
Yeah. I think one thing I always like to start these conversations out is that, the conversation always leads us like, is it a problem? Are kids worried about this? Right. And so just to dive into some of the data here, we do know that kids and young people, young adults, have increased worries about a changing future. It's hard to grow up with an uncertain future. And it's also hard to assess this, but there's been some really kind of breakthrough studies that have started to really unpack this. Carolyn Hickman, back in 2021, kind of had the most kind of robust landmark. You may have already discussed this article on your podcast, but it was a global survey of 10,000 young people, and the results were quite humbling. It was like 60% were either very or extremely worried. 84% were at least moderately worried about climate change. 45%, so nearly half, had feelings that their thoughts about climate change negatively impacted their day-to-day life and functioning. So this is not just in the United States, this is across the world. This particular survey was looking at young adults between 16 and 25 years old. And I think I think that data is humbling. So I'll just let that sit for a second. But that same team followed up with another survey that was dedicated just in the United States. This was a more recent study. This is a 2024 article. This looked at over 15,000 kids. And again, looking at this young adult range, 16 to 25, seeing a very similar breakdown within the United States. 85% extremely worried, or at least moderately worried about climate change, with 57, almost 60% very or extremely worried. Again, about 40% showed that this impacted their daily life and functioning. What was very interesting about this particular study is that they actually looked at political boundaries and layers, and saw that across Democratic, Republican parties, young people had an extended worry about climate change. So again, this is not an isolated issue. This is something that we see across the board. I think the other thing that I'll just bring up is we think about young adults as they are entering adulthood and thinking about their role in the global sphere as starting to think about these larger issues. We are also seeing increases in young people. I'm part of a team right now looking at middle school and young high school students. And we're seeing, this is very preliminary data, unpublished, and we're still crunching the numbers, but starting to see increases in even those younger students as well. And so there's a lot of nuance, and I can happy to talk about demographic breakdowns of who seems to be more worried than not, but this is a problem and something that we're trying to address.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I really like the way you frame that. I also wanted to touch on how climate disasters fit into this, because Coco's story starts with a fire that displaces her family. And that's something that can happen in real life. And for a lot of people, that might be their first real exposure to climate change. So I'm curious, how challenging was it to take that complex topic and translate it into something accessible for our children?
Well, we really were trying to think about, well, first of all, as we were developing this book, we were like, okay, who are we actually writing this for? Or, are we writing it for the 16-year-old that Dr. Hickman was looking at her, or are we writing it for someone else? And when we actually broke down the ages, we realized that there was this gap where most young people start having their first environmental science class in around 4th, 5th grade, somewhere in later elementary school. Yet, when we look at data on when young people are started to be introduced to complex, harder, nuanced topics, typically the literature looks like, when do you involve kids in their own health decisions and heavy diagnoses or things like that? Obviously in developmentally appropriate ways, but it could be as early as like 3 to 5 years old of when you start to talk to kids about harder things. And then we also thought about when young people are actually hearing about climate change. And we realized that there was this window where young people between like 6 and 8 were aware enough of the global system. They were hearing about climate change in the news, or their friends were talking about it, but yet they didn't have the space to talk about it in school, but they had the emotional capacity to start to appreciate the nuance and complexity of these larger issues. And so there was this gap here of younger elementary school kids who didn't necessarily have this conversation laid out, yet they were hearing this from a number of sources. And so when we started to try to navigate, well, what does this look like for typical families? Most of the conversations evolved into like, well, kids are hearing it on the recess yard. Kids are hearing it on the news. Kids are hearing it in ways that are not as structured, that are not as controlled. And so the way we tried to represent that was a letter that Coco gets from her aunt, who is kind of experiencing and undergoing a forest fire, and representing this. It was published at a time when a lot of the forest fires were happening in California. So it was like within that spirit to represent how many of young people are actually hearing about climate change and uncertain what that means or uncertain what that is. And so that's how we tried to do it. We also wanted to separate what our book was from other resources that are available for climate-related traumas, right? There are resources available, and actually ACAP has a disaster and trauma committee that focuses on thinking about how do you navigate young people through climate disasters. And there's also a number of children's books to like work through that kind of acute trauma. And we wanted to separate what our book was from others. And we wanted to separate that this was actually more thinking about these existential questions of what it means to grow up with this uncertain future, rather than processing a direct trauma. And so we also wanted to separate it from that.
Well, it makes a lot of sense in terms of trying to weave together a lot of these different themes, and done in a coherent way that helps to process, share information that touches a lot of the layers of this issue and a lot of layers of kids' lives and families' lives. And as we're talking about the inception and development of the book, you mentioned that it was a team of folks who went into the development of Coco's Fire. And I feel it would be really helpful to hear about some of the team in the background, specifically your co-author, Lena Champlin. I was hoping to hear a little bit about how that relationship sort of manifested and what the collaboration looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, she is my forever collaborator. We're married.
Oh,
and we met in college studying. We both studied geology and grew up together in many ways, thinking about these issues from different perspectives. She's gone on to pursue a career in environmental science, currently a postdoc at BU, and studying the many ways climate impacts coastal ecosystems, and specifically how we can think about coastal ecosystems as sequesters of carbon and what it means to engage young people in that work. And so she is an incredible climate advocate and scientist in her own right. And actually, this first idea came about. Lena did her postdoc or her PhD at a natural history museum in Philadelphia, part of the Academy of Natural Sciences. And she would do a lot of outreach in those to young people. And most of it was regarding climate change. And one of these events let a little girl run up to Lena. Lena had a big sign, "What's climate change?" And the little girl's like, "What's climate change?" And kind of to both of our surprises, the mom or the caregiver of this girl came up, put her hand over her ears. We don't talk about climate change. We don't talk about climate change yet. Kind of in the same way you would hear, "Oh, we don't talk about death. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about divorce," right? Like all of these heavy topics, right? And so Lena was kind of taken aback and being like, "Well, we should talk to young people about this work, but in the right way, right? We don't want to scare kids. We want to talk about it in the right way." And so that's honestly where some of this started, where we were like, how do we communicate this to kids in a way that feels good? And so that actually led us to working with, so there's a number of professional agencies and organizations all thinking about psychiatry and climate change. The American Psychiatric Association, as you guys are aware, is the big one. They have a think tank called the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry. And they have a number of subcommittees as well. And so they actually have a committee on climate change. And so we reached out to them, and it's a team, an incredible team of lovely psychiatrists. At the time, it was led by Elizabeth Haas, Janet Lewis, Beth Mark. My brother Josh Wortzel was actually on the committee at that same time. And so we reached out to them and we're like, "Hey, we have an idea. We'd like to write this narrative, this model climate talk in a way that can engage in people, but we want to ground it in as much evidence as possible. Would you guys want to help us in this work?" And as part of it, we write this children's book. We want all the proceeds to go back to actually more research in this field. So at the start, most of the proceeds went for the Group of the Advancement of Psychiatry. Now all of the proceeds go to the Group of the Advancement of Psychiatry's Climate Committee to continue to champion this work. But that group, entirely composed of psychiatrists, both adult and child psychiatrists, we were really fortunate in that several family members were also educators in that space. And so we could actually have some focus groups with kindergarten, first grade, and second grade teachers and with their students as well. We also looped in additional environmental scientists to kind of make sure that, again, our work was as accurate as possible. And so this was a really multidisciplinary team that allowed us to kind of workshop this over the course of about a year and a half before we actually landed on the story in there.
Wow, that's a better answer than I ever could have possibly imagined or expected.
Amazing. Yeah.
Fantastic. So one of the clear themes that you were able to develop through all this collaboration, this work, Focus Fire, is connectedness. It's something that can help children name the distress they may be feeling and help to manage it. And one of the ways this manifests in the book is Coco's dad encouraging her to open up and being there for her in varying ways, and how we're talking about engaging with children in real life. So the book clearly serves as a potential tool for parents to engage with their children on this topic in a way that might seem overwhelming, as we're getting at part of the reason for coming up with the book in the first place. So I'm wondering, do you have any other suggestions on how parents could engage with their kids, help them manage their anxieties as it relates to this topic?
Absolutely. To be a little bit more concrete about it, we developed this climate talk. And what does that actually mean? And, what we did is, we did a cursory literature review on all of the resources that were available at the time. So this was back in 2020, 2021, of how to navigate these hard conversations. So we looked at the literature on how to talk to kids about death, divorce, sex, all of those books. We looked at the current books that were available for, introducing climate change to young kids. And gosh, was that a journey unto itself? You see all of these things where, it's the cover is this cute little polar bear on this lone iceberg in the middle of, or there's one where the Statue of Liberty has the sea level up to its eyes, like these really kind of disaster. And so it was really interesting getting the lay of the land of what those are. And also of books like the Lorax that are these pillars of inspired generations of people in this. But it was actually an article in the Lancet that came out, I think it was in 2020. So it was right around the time we were thinking about this. And it was looking at how children's books at bedtime, because you had so many families wanting environmentally family, all of the, I'm sure all of us would try to find as many environmental books as we could to read to our kids, right? And it was showing how that was increasing anxiety at bedtime. So to step back, we go to this committee, right? We're like, okay, we want to address this in some way. We land on a children's book. And so then we do this analysis or this literature review on what to do. And we're like, gosh, actually reading a book about climate change at bedtime could be really rough. And as part of that, one of the tropes that came out was most of them involved, gosh, the older generation messed up. Good luck fixing it, kid. Right? Like that's the Lorax, right? It's the Wortzel throwing the seed to the next generation, right? And while empowering to many, right, it's also like extremely daunting for so many too. And so we really tried to be very thoughtful about how we flipped that narrative and how we structured this climate talk in a way that was as evidence-based as possible. And specifically, that was one that was welcoming. And so we developed this talk. And so the components are very similar to how you would approach any challenging issue. You want to start with what they already know, right? It's always easy to go in and talk to a kid, tell a kid what you think they need to know, but they've probably already heard stuff and they might have misconceptions and worries that you don't know. So understanding where they're starting from, addressing any of the cute anxiety. So step 2 is doing some grounding exercise. In the book, we have some like circular breathings. We actually use the analogy of blowing out a little candle, representing this kind of fire. There's this kind of theme throughout the book. Explaining the issue, right? This could be the mechanics of sex, what happens when you die. For us, it was the science of climate change. And in a way, and using metaphors that were helpful and true to the nuance. It's so easy to say like, oh, the Earth gets warmer. That's not entirely true. The Earth is a mess of feedback systems that causes extremes, both hot and cold, more storms, less storms. It's really nuanced. And so trying to develop a metaphor that was true to the science, but easy for kids to understand. So that was explaining the science. Thinking about what the ramifications are. What are the problems, right? Not to sugarcoat things, but to represent what actually can happen, whether it's, again, storms or whatever it is, right? And so trying to outline and talking about the solutions, which is the next step. And not just recycling, but solutions that feel meaningful. And so we did a lot of work onto what are individual things that people can do that actually feel meaningful. And what ultimately came about as writing letters to people in authority. And so you'll see that part of what we do, part of it is protesting and raising awareness. Part of it is engaging in alternative fuels and using wind turbines and things like that. But the larger narrative is actually writing to your legislation and having them pass legislation to change larger things. And each person's words really matter in that space. And so thinking not only on an individual level, but on a community level. How do you engage with this, again, this welcoming community? And as we go through all of these things, we're also meeting the scientists, meeting the community members, meeting the politicians, thinking about welcoming folks in. You're not alone, in other words. And then finally, as the book comes to a close, as the climate talk comes to a close, we open it up for future conversations, right? This should not be a one and done thing. Just like you shouldn't talk about death and being like, all right, you're good, kid. Like, you want to make sure that you create spaces for future conversations and to recognize that this is a first step on understanding where things are at and that you can come back. The final piece, and the piece that I think inspires so many to think about climate change and this work in the first place, is that something that came up time and time again in our lit review was the importance of inspiring kids with natural wonder. Kids who love nature are thinking about these larger issues inherently, but they're also more likely to address and engage with that later on. And so part of this book is also recognizing the beauty around us. And we'll talk about in a little bit, but a lot of my current work actually is focused on that part. How do we get kids outside? We know the power of nature immersion. We know the power of even looking at pictures of nature. And so how do we incorporate this therapeutically in many ways, both to address climate distress, but also for general feelings of mental health and wellness? So that was the narrative. That was the climate talk that we were hoping to convey. And we created a narrative around what we thought was an evidence-based approach to that talk.
Yeah, that was really helpful. And I think something that stands out is how difficult this can be for parents too, especially when we think about the broader generational stress around climate change. It can be hard to have the emotional bandwidth to support their children while also managing their own reactions. So, building on that, what are some practical strategies for parents to navigate that?
Oh, absolutely. When we think about being a good caregiver in any respect, right? If you're caring for a sick parent, if it's just being a parent in general, caring for your child, the most effective thing we can do is to take care of ourselves, right? On planes, you have to put on your mask before you put on the mask of somebody else, right? And so making sure that you have the supports that you need, taking an hour out of your day for your own psychotherapy, for your own walk or nature experience, or to read a book or take a bath or whatever you need to do. We know how important exercise can be. I think for many parents, not a parent, but for many parents, the concept of taking time for yourself feels selfish, when I think reframing that for yourself and saying the better you can be really is the better caregiver that you're going to be. And so having a moment for yourself, engaging in mental health hygiene, all of these things that I'm saying, whether it is a mindful practice, whether it's an outdoor practice, if it's getting exercise, or just getting enough sleep, all of these things I think will allow you to approach these conversations with a more thoughtful and
the airplane analogy is one I really, really like. I think that's very easy to translate. You got to something about translating the anxiety into action being a helpful way of both contributing to the world around us in a meaningful way, as well as to helping to manage those anxieties and those feelings in the transition of the flame character. And we've already touched on this a little bit in terms of how this manifests in the book, and ways this could manifest in real life. But I'm wondering if for folks who are listening here, either parents thinking about ways to engage with their kids, or if a kid happened to be thinking about these things on their own, what are some examples of easy or translatable or accessible things that could be as a recommendation for a listener to get involved?
Well, typically the mantra that I use when I counsel folks about when they're anxious about the changing future, the climate distress, I usually say, get educated, right, in a developmentally appropriate way. And for parents, that might mean doing a little research on their own, but also it could also mean looking at a book like this, ours or others. There are many others that I think could be really helpful in kind of providing the context that's needed. It could also mean monitoring your media content, right? So many of us doom scroll, right? And so making sure that the content that we're getting is we have to monitor our own. We can't just flood ourselves with negative thoughts, right? We need to engage in material, but in a healthy way. And so I think that sometimes doing less can be the first step, which is an ironic. The second thing is to get involved, right? And concrete ways of getting involved could be as simple as thinking about your individual carbon footprint. I've mentioned some like recycling or using less energy, switching out your light bulbs to more efficient light bulbs in your house. And there are certainly resources. We actually include a whole resource page in the back of your book to kind of engage with some of those things of addressing and even measuring your own carbon footprint. Having no meat Mondays, that type of thing, that can be really, really helpful. And as a family that they can engage in all together. Why aren't we having chicken tonight? We usually have chicken on Mondays. Oh, tonight we're going to have a different meal because we're thinking about the world around us. But we'll have chicken tomorrow night. Whatever it is, right? Little things like that can be actually have lasting impacts. But it can also be contacting your legislator, and going down to a protest as people feel safe. And again, developmentally, we're working with young kids too. That might not be the best place for a young person, but to monitor that and as parents use their discretion to see what might be a good fit for young people. I'll also say that there's a double-edged sword with getting involved, right? It can be really inspiring. It can also lead to a lot of burnout. And so, as I mentioned with getting educated, sometimes stepping back when you need to step back is important for the sustainability of keeping involved in this work, right? And the last piece, which again I think is the piece that resonated with me as I was researching this, which is getting outside. So again, to summarize, getting educated, getting involved, and then getting outside. And I want to just take a second to talk about getting outside because I think I think in psychiatry specifically, we importantly are moving more biologic as a field. We're starting to understand these biological mechanisms, importantly so. But we are also losing some of the incredible power of the simple, lowest hanging fruit around us, which is so many kids are on their phones all day long and it's overstimulating. It can be really scary. Getting outside is shown on a number of levels to be helpful for mental health. It's helpful both from developing pro-social behaviors, getting exercise, but even on a passive level, we see randomized control trials where they remediate vacant lots in urban centers and see how folks living around these lots, even passively just walking by nature can be helpful. We see folks looking at pictures of nature on and what their brain does on fMRI imaging. We see the stress response centers light up. During COVID, I did a study where we looked at the amount of green space that was within a person's zip code. We controlled for all of these factors. And simply, if you had just more green space in your zip code, you had lower rates of COVID-specific worries. And actually, there was an interesting study that came out at that time where they were looking at the amount of green space you could see out your window and how important that could even be. Now, we even can see this therapeutically. We know that engaging in horticultural therapy and nature exposure therapy can be really such an incredible augmentation agent to many of our typical psychotherapeutic and psychopharmacological interventions. I think it's an exciting frontier because it allows, I think, both a frontier as well as a remembrance of something that we intrinsically all use, of getting outside, of sitting at the beach and being like, wow, I just needed a second, right? It's something that historically has been done for centuries. Hippocrates, has a quote that's or is credited at least, that says, nature itself is the best clinician, right? You have the Enlightenment thinkers that are all talking about getting outside for this peace and tranquility. Sanitariums in the 1930s, right? Where people were just being like, I don't know what's going on, but let's get them outside and like hope for the best, right? Like, and so I think that there's something intrinsic that we all appreciate, and we're starting to fully understand and unpack the mechanism of why it's helpful. And so I think as parents, as caregivers, as psychiatrists, don't underestimate the power of a recommendation. We have this incredible platform, and a recommendation or a nature prescription of like, I think we need to go for a walk once a week, right? Or a lot of the recommendations are 20 to 30 minutes, 3 times a week, both from an exercise perspective, but also from a nature exposure perspective, can be really therapeutic. Both, again, we're starting to understand it. And I'm actually part of a couple of studies right now looking at it specifically for climate distress, but for general mental health as well.
And shifting toward clinicians, I think you already talked about this, but what are some key things we should be thinking about or incorporating into our practice when it comes to this?
There's a few things. And also I can send you guys a scoping literature review I did on pediatric climate distress with specific clinical recommendations. And again, I'm happy to send that along to you guys.
Please, we can include that in the show notes for our listeners as well.
I think there's a couple of things, right? And I think about, as clinicians, there's a diagnostic perspective, there's a therapeutic perspective, and then there's what do we prescribe, right? And so from a diagnostic perspective, I think it's important to first appreciate that young people are worried about this. This is something that should and I think is starting to be involved in a lot of our screening questions. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize the difference between what a pathological fear of a changing future is and a reasonable response to a growing climate crisis, right? What I'm saying here is not to pathologize something that I think is actually very reasonable. There will certainly be a spectrum of obsessional, ruminative folks who are just thinking about this too much, and it's impacting their day-to-day life, and certainly that might fall into a different bucket. But I think it's important to validate that this is a crisis, right? The changing future is scary, and there's not a clear answer. And so recognizing that this is present and growing, but also not something that is necessarily pathological, I think is an important differential for clinicians. And therapeutically, I think this is the mantra, right, of getting educated, getting involved, getting outside. And I think within each of those capacities, luckily there's a host of resources, whether it is connecting folks with the CPA and becoming a climate-informed therapist, or learning how to do a climate cafe, or kind of grounding themselves on this work, so that they recognize that even prescribing practices may need to change in a changing climate, right? And thinking about, well, lithium on a hot day, let's think about that, right? And so I think that there's parts as clinicians we can do of getting informed, and parts that we can and recommend our patients get involved in. Specifically, I think about the Good Grief Network and recommending communities that our patients can become a part of, to be around other people who are thinking critically about these issues. And I think it just as another set of resources, ACAP has a number of resources on their resource page to help families and clinicians really understand kind of what is going on and the nuance there. So that's the getting educated, getting involved. We've talked a bit about both on a personal level and on a local level, a national level. And then getting outside, thinking critically about nature prescriptions, thinking if you can, add that to your recommendations within, okay, we're going to start an SSRI, we're going to start our CBT, and part of your homework is to take one walk with your family around the block before our next visit, right? And again, not only to increase the sense of curiosity and wonder within kids, not only to get kids off devices and interacting in a pro-social way, not only to have some exercise, but even to have some exposure to nature. At worst, this is a benign, lovely intervention that could bring you closer together as a family. And at best, it's a, therapeutic augmentation agent to all of our other practices.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think those would be the things that I would recommend.
Yeah, that's great. And as we talk about how these lessons from Coco's Fire can be integrated into folks' lives, I'm curious, have you received any feedback or questions coming from folks who have, read the book or had it shared with them?
Yeah. I think there's been a couple of really interesting conversations, I think the first being, and I think this is a nuanced topic and open to conversation, right? There are young people who haven't heard about climate change. By reading this book, are we starting a fear that didn't exist? Right? And I think that's important and something that I still think critically about. I'm not here to say I think we need to tell every young person about this, that there may be kids that would stimulate some anxiety, specifically if they have a more anxious disposition, right? And so I also want to reinforce that this is a parental discretion, right? Parents have discretion to talk about sex and divorce and drugs or whatever it is, right? And so this is something that, as a clinician, I can make a recommendation. We've developed this as a thoughtful approach as we possibly could to be at the right developmental stage. But also, I don't want to force any families into something that they're not excited to talk about. I think the other component too, is this is a challenging time to talk about climate change, right? And I'm sure this has made it into the podcast in other ways, but this is challenging from a research perspective. It's challenging to get funding to study this stuff. From just a political perspective, it's challenging to use the phrase climate change, right? And so a number of families or a number of schools, actually, we were working with schools on like, well, how do we do this? And I was like, oh, well, this just won't get approved right now. And I'd like to just take a second to step back and being like, I don't care about the term climate change. In fact, the term I actually like to use is environmental health. Within the term, there's mental health. And so I always try to hyphenate. I take the enviro and I have the mental health, right? And I highlight this idea that we're just talking about these environmental determinants. We want the same thing for our young people, which is healthy, safe, good development, right? And so what I am also fascinated by is this incredible Venn diagram that I was never expecting. But it's this idea where that on both sides of the party, we can all agree that getting kids outside and getting kids off screens and trying to create a healthy space for our young people to grow up is a good thing, right? That's pretty universal state that we do. And so in many ways, I think in a lot of the conversations that I have now, I think about how do we create this conversation that circumvents a lot of the political nature of it. And we can say, okay, getting kids outside, getting kids inspired by nature, and thinking about all of the changes in our environment. We were just talking about at the start of the thing. It's rainy today. It snowed last week. What's going on, right? We don't have to say it's climate change, but it is, right? We don't have to say that. I think could be an interesting way to go through. And I would be remiss as a lifelong climate activist to say that that's also very different than how I usually approach this work, which is you just got to scream it at the top of your lungs too. And so there is no one right way to handle this, but I think it's an interesting thing to note that we are seeing this common denominator right now. And something that I'm exploring right now too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also be remiss not to mention some of the fantastic feedback that can be seen readily on the book, like the Amazon reviews, for example. Somebody talking about how their 3-year-old was engaged and able to understand the gentle explanations of the climate crisis. You mentioned how schools are a challenging place to potentially engage this, but as an effective resource, we have I loved this book. It warmed my heart and made me smile. The illustrations are sweet and beautiful. I bought 3 already for my granddaughters who are elementary school teachers. We have a lot of great clinician feedback. So um, it's well worth your while to check out the book if you haven't and you're listening to this podcast. And we should highlight that Coco's Fire is available also as a narrated video on YouTube. You can look for Coco's Fire, Changing Climate Anxiety into Climate Action, available freely for viewing. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your favorite aspects of, the video or the book in general?
It's just been incredible to work with this amazing team of clinicians, scientists, researchers. I should also mention my wife did all the illustrations of this book as well. She's an environmental artist as well. And so it's just an incredible collaborative experience. And so it's been one of the highlights of my academic career so far that I've been able to incorporate this into this work. I should also mention that all of the proceeds go to the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry's Climate Committee for their ongoing research into understanding and educating families about this issue. So, no, it's been so lovely, and I can't thank you guys enough for having me on the podcast to talk about this today. This is great.
Well, we can't thank you enough for joining. And we should highlight, in terms of if you're looking to grab a physical copy of the book or something to read together with your kids, Coco's Fire is available for purchase on Amazon. There is a Kindle version as well. And it is well worth being looked into and purchasing and checking out. You mentioned we'd circle back to this later as well. I really enjoyed exploring Coco's Fire, the inception, the development, the messaging. But in terms of some of the other work that you had mentioned, you recently co-authored a very interesting article in the Psychiatric Times entitled "Nature Nurtures: Evidence for Nature's Impact on Mental Well-Being." Could you tell us a little bit?
Well, as I've mentioned, the getting outside part of my mantra of how to address this has been something that I have continually been thinking critically about. And specifically, how do we incorporate it therapeutically into our clinical practice? And so throughout my residency, I've really tried to think about the spaces that our patients inhabit and how we can incorporate more and more green space into it. Because unfortunately, so much of our work is done, on locked inpatient psychiatric units and spaces that don't really lend themselves well to kind of the healing spaces that I know I would appreciate in times of stress and vulnerability. And so one thing that I have been exploring are the fresh air laws within Massachusetts and across the country that require, as part of the patient panel of rights, sometimes reasonable access to outdoor space. And I think what's been so interesting is to see how widely this has been interpreted amongst so many different sites, even within the state of Massachusetts. And so as part of that, one thing that came to light on I'll give you just a few examples of ways that we've been able to try and do this on our inpatient unit here at Faulkner Hospital in Boston. They have a really beautiful screened-in porch area. Unfortunately, due to some construction, all of the views of trees were just blocked away. And we were like, oh my goodness, how could we inspire something here to re-engage folks in nature on this otherwise locked unit? And what we started to do was this nature art project where we installed immersive kind of 12-foot, like wall-to-ceiling, stickers, wallpaper of artwork that was donated by actually a family physician turned nature photographer called Dr. Henry Domke. And we were then studying how the impact that this intervention had on not only qualitative feedback from patients and staff, but also thinking about health metrics and thinking about like length of stay and number of restraints and the amount of medications people are given for agitation and anxiety. And we just completed that study and the preliminary data is really interesting where, obviously folks, both staff and patients, were really positive about trying to integrate multisensory approaches to integrating nature into therapeutic sessions. But from a quantitative standpoint, we looked at a specific team. So the way we designed the study was we had the intervention go up, and we looked at the amount of Ativan, which is a medication that's used for agitation and anxiety, and we looked at the amount of as needed Ativan that was needed for 4 months following the intervention, and seasonally matched that for 2 years prior. And we looked at a specific team that was covered by the same psychiatrist for all 3 years. And we saw this decrease in Ativan use. Now, obviously, this is an exploratory analysis, and there's many factors that we are, unable to control for. But it harkens this kind of potential clinical benefit to even just having something as simple as a picture of green space on an inpatient unit. And so this has inspired a lot of discussion around what do our units actually look like? How do we engage people in green interventions? I'm currently working on another project at Boston Children's Hospital where we're developing some curricula around what that outdoor time actually looks like. Could we make it meaningful? Could we make it therapeutic? I'm also working at a youth homeless shelter here in Boston to develop a garden and a space that's designed by the youth within that facility, designing their own backyard, right, that they can engage with. And again, starting to study what health metrics change pre and post all of these interventions. I think my philosophy in research is to try and just make as many beautiful spaces for patients as we possibly can to increase their healing therapeutic venues. But also, there's these kernels that you can glean from each of these interventions so that we can start to understand this larger complexity of what our brain does when it's exposed to green space. So it's been a really interesting journey in trying to, again, think about this simple statement of getting outside and how does that apply to clinicians in a way that could be meaningful, that could be therapeutic. And frankly, I think on a very deep level, is really humanistic. I think it's what patients need to feel part of the world around them as they're going through what for many is the most vulnerable time in their life, a mental health crisis. And so to be part of a larger ecosystem, to be part of the world, I could think of nothing more profound for someone going through that time. And so redefining what that relationship is in mental health, I think, has been an interesting journey.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really inspiring. It actually makes me think about the units I'm working here in New York City, where green space is pretty limited, and it really highlights how much more we could be doing as psychiatrists in the future.
I think it's an exciting time, and also getting kids outside is just fun, right? There's something different where I had this patient say we built this garden recently, and I was watering this flower with the patient, and it was like so simple, where it was just like, oh yeah, this flower needs some water, and it's like, oh yeah, this flower needs water like I need hugs, and it's like, yeah, we all need care, we all need love, right? And it's this way that at a time when they are kind of receiving a lot of care, they can give some care too. And so I think it's just really beautiful. It's also really interesting how the dynamics change when you're both doing something, when you're both walking, when you're both watering. Changes the power dynamic of what your interactions are like with patients. So yeah, I'm pro trees, assuming it's great.
I think that's a very controversial coming out with there, but when you're mentioning how this is important for everybody, I think highlighting the everybody in that statement and how folks don't have equal opportunity of access to these types of venues and environments is an important thing. Something that you do in the paper that we had mentioned, and it reminded me of work that I'd read in the past of like Dr. Jeremy Hoffman's study coming out, looking at various cities across the U.S. And how redlining showed, even to this day, folks still having less access to green space, more concrete and permeable surfaces, leading to, hotter exposures, more emergency department visits, poorer health outcomes. And that just shows how everything is connected, as we all know, and towards leading us being holistic humans, how our physical, mental, just holistic, environmental. I love that statement. Health is all connected. So I would encourage all of our readers to check out the article as well.
Well, Casey, I think that is honestly the secret subplot of my life and career is thinking about how do we engage cities and urban planners, and thinking about, green space is not just an environmental justice issue, it's a mental health issue, it's a citywide issue, and it's a psychiatric issue. And it's part of our responsibility as clinicians to think, what are the cities like that our young people are growing up in? What resources do they have, right? Giving a pill to somebody doesn't change that their walk home is scary, right? Or whatever that means, right? Medication is fundamental, and I don't mean to minimize it, but it's a piece of the solution. And I think critically that for so many psychiatrists, our lane begins and ends in that clinic room. And I always just want to encourage people that it's been really liberating to step beyond that and to start to talk to policymakers and civil servants and thinking about, this area needs renovation. How do we do this in a way that is meaningful and therapeutic? And so I think that's the secret message that if I can convey to clinicians that this is our lane, and that this is something that we can work towards and really can change the lives of our patients.
Absolutely. In a way that's sort of your own Coco's Fire journey in terms of exploring the other ways that you can engage.
100%.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your fantastic work, both surrounding Coco's Fire as well as otherwise, and a lot of excellent pearls for our listeners, who I think I may have referred to as readers just now, but
we hope soon to be readers.
Soon to be readers. So I'm wondering if there's any sort of last bits of information that you feel like would be really helpful for folks to hear about, where people can connect with you, find your work. We'd really love to hear.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me on today and just being able to talk about this cool work. What you guys do is so meaningful as well. Making sure that people are aware of all of these things is half the battle, more than half the battle, honestly. And so having this kind of global communication, I think, is so powerful. But I really appreciate this. All I can say to clinicians is, we are operating in uncertain times. This is a different area. This is a different time than ever before. And I think we need to approach it in a way that feels meaningful, that feels dignified, that feels therapeutic. And so I think we can, and we can. We have the resources, we have the technology, and we have the podcast to help support us. So I'm excited for the future.
Thank you so much again, Jeremy.
Appreciate it. Casey, Mario, good to see you guys both again, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on another conversation on the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the work of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, please consider subscribing or donating to climatepsychiatry.org. Let's work together to build a healthier planet and a healthier mind. Take care.